Hello, my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 tier list and guide. Hope you're all doing well. So I know I said at the end of my last consumables tier list with poisons, oils, and coatings that I was finished with all of the consumables, but several people pointed out that there was a category of consumables I hadn't covered, the miscellaneous consumables, barrels, fireworks, satchels, etc., and so I thought, why not do a secret bonus tier list to cover those items? This item category contains some of the most broken items in the entire game. And I mean broken both in the sense of much too powerful to exist in the game, and also in the sense of does not work or works in a completely different way than the tooltip would indicate or than you'd expect in-game. So I think that it can be extremely valuable to go over how these items actually work, which ones are worth using when you see them in the world, and which ones are actually worth stockpiling and using throughout your adventuring career. While these items cannot be crafted, and most of them cannot be purchased from merchants, with a couple exceptions that I'll mention when we get to them, they are often quite plentiful, and you can collect as many of them as you want, which you can either use to cheese encounters and win them instantly, or just as actual tools in combat. Now, obviously with these items, the most common way to use them, or at least the way you see most commonly talked about, is so-called barrelmancy, where you collect an enormous number of these explosive items and then place dozens of them next to an enemy out of combat, either by placing them next to a neutral enemy before combat starts, or next to a hostile enemy using an invisible character or something like that. Then you set off the gigantic pile of explosives all at once to issue thousands of damage to an enemy in a single action, because you can just place all of these explosives before combat starts and instantly win any encounter in the game. There's basically no encounter in the game that you can't cheese using the explosive tools that the game gives you, and that's part of why these items are so broken. That being said, while I don't think that way of cheesing all the encounters is cheating, clearly that's a way that the developers intended these items to be used, because you can place them and detonate them, so placing and detonating the items is definitely an intended mechanic in the game. I do think that it's not very interesting to rate on a tier list. One-shotting any encounter in the game just isn't a particularly interesting thing to discuss when we are talking about how powerful these items are. So as we go through them, I'm going to be rating them as though we actually have to spend resources in combat to use them, either by throwing them and then subsequently igniting them, or by actually walking up to a hostile enemy, placing the item, getting away, and then igniting it. So we'll be discussing whether it's useful to use these as part of a real combat strategy, not just as part of an out-of-combat strategy to one-shot any encounter in the game. I just think that's both more interesting to discuss and more useful to most players who probably aren't actually that interested in winning every single encounter in the game just by collecting explosives, both because it's tedious and because it's not very fun. So hopefully you get some use out of this tier list to tell you whether these are worth actually using as part of a real combat strategy. At this point, if you've seen any of my other consumables tier lists, you know the drill on the tiers, but in S tier, we will be placing every one of these that you want to stockpile as many of as possible. If you see one of these, you should pick it up. If you can buy it from a merchant or steal it from an NPC, you should buy it or steal it, and you'll be using them regularly in combat as part of a main strategy. In A tier, I have ones that are powerful but usually situational. They require a little bit more setup. In B tier, ones that can come up pretty frequently and are reasonable uses of your action, especially if you have nothing better to do. In C tier, items that are typically going to be outclassed by your character's abilities, but will occasionally come up. And in D tier, items that are usually just not worth picking up off the ground because the effect is relatively marginal, so you can just leave them there, though they are still sometimes worth targeting if they show up in a combat arena and you happen to see a good use for them. Without any further ado, let's rate all of the miscellaneous and environmental consumables, starting with the acid barrel. So first I should mention that the barrels all work in slightly different ways. As will become a theme as we go through this tier list, you will get used to hearing me say that things work in slightly different or inconsistent ways. There are three possible ways to activate a barrel, and different barrels have different activation triggers. Some of these can use all three of them, some of them can use only one of them, some of them can use multiples, but you get different effects if you do different things to them. You can either throw a barrel to break it open at the location and activate its effect. Break it with a weapon attack of some kind, or by reducing its hit points to 0 if it's just in the world, or hit it with fire in order to get the ignition effect, which some barrels have. Different barrels will have different effects depending on what kind of thing they are, whether you hit them with fire damage, reduce their hit points to 0, or throw them, and those different effects will often be radically different depending on the activation method, so it's important to keep in mind how different barrels actually work. For the acid barrel, there are two ways to activate it. You can just break it, or you can throw it. It has 1 hit point, so if you throw it, it will always take enough damage to break, and then at the location that the barrel was or was thrown to, you get a 20-foot acid surface. Throwing it uses a throw action, so usually an attack action, but a bonus action if you're a Berserker Barbarian who's raging. And so you can create a 20-foot radius acid surface on the ground, either by throwing the acid barrel or by breaking it. An acid surface has a no saving throw -2 to AC to any creature standing inside of it, so you get a fairly large radius surface that reduces enemy AC by 2. You might remember that I said the acid arrow was quite good, because reducing enemies' AC by 2 on an arrow attack is pretty powerful, but the barrel obviously has a much higher opportunity cost, because you have to either spend an attack to break it in some way, or throw it yourself, and so you're spending a whole action, or at the very least a bonus action, in order to give an enemy -2 AC on subsequent actions. That's not a 0. There are times when it can be useful to reduce an enemy's AC by 2, especially for a Berserker Barbarian. You could use this with your bonus action throw and then have an easier time hitting with your subsequent throws, but a Tavern Brawler Barbarian, which, let's face it, you probably are, is not going to need reduced enemy AC to hit anyways, so most of the time you're spending a character's whole action, or half of their attack, on making an attack slightly easier to hit. You will probably be able to recognize that effect from a spell that comes up pretty frequently on this channel, and that spell is True Strike. Spending an attack action to make subsequent attacks easier to hit without doing any damage is just almost never worth it. There are very few circumstances where -2 AC is going to be worth spending an attack, because that attack could have just gone at the enemy for extra damage. Even if you have a character who has nothing better to do on their turn than throw an acid barrel, they probably are still better off just firing an arrow. Like, even if you have a low dexterity character, they're probably still better off just taking a bow shot at an enemy than chucking an acid barrel, or using a cantrip or something, or even just dashing to get into a better position. It's very rarely going to be worth an action in combat to set up the acid surface. Acid surfaces also can't be converted into anything else. They can't be frozen or set on fire or anything like that, so you're stuck with the acid surface, and that means that the acid barrel just has very little utility. I don't recommend picking this up, carrying it, or paying attention to them in the world, because the acid effect is just relatively minor and not worth spending an action on. If you get it as part of another action, that's fine, so you can break the acid barrel with an AoE spell next to an enemy, and that's probably the best use for it, if they happen to be standing next to one, is catching the acid barrel in an AoE to make your subsequent attacks easier to hit, but for the most part you can safely ignore the acid barrel. D tier. Next, the Brine Barrel. So the Brine Barrel, similar to the acid barrel, can either be thrown or broken open in order to get the effect. It also creates a 20-foot radius surface of acid, but in this case the acid is caustic brine rather than the acid surface. Caustic brine does 1d4 acid damage per turn to enemies who are inside of it, or to creatures who are inside of it, and that damage is guaranteed. There's no saving throw. If you are standing in it, then you take 1d4 damage at the beginning of your turn. 1d4 guaranteed damage isn't completely useless. Obviously, that's not an incredible amount of damage, but anything that happens without a saving throw of any kind associated with it can be pretty powerful in this game, because If an enemy is at 2 health, the Brine Barrel can very reliably kill them. If you have a group of low health enemies, then the Brine Barrel can be used to defeat them, and also because of the extremely large radius, this can, unlike the Caustic Bulb item, sometimes not be an embarrassing use of your action just in terms of damage efficiency. If you can hit, say, 5 enemies with it, that's 5d4 acid damage, and then if you can keep them trapped in it, that might be even more acid damage. And while that's nothing that you're going to write home about, that is still a pretty reasonable use of an action, especially in the very early game, in terms of efficiency of damage to action. So there are times when the Brine Barrel can be a reasonable amount of damage in the early game. That said, it's only 1d4 damage per turn, so it's not going to be a significant contributor to most combats, but guaranteed damage is always worth looking at. It can also be ignited, so you can throw the Brine Barrel and then hit that for 1d4 damage, and then hit that surface with with some form of fire, igniting the surface, dealing more damage to the enemy, and lighting them on fire. So if you combine this with fire damage, you can get a little bit of extra damage. To be honest, I don't actually know where the Brine Barrels show up in the game. I looked around to see if I could find any, and I couldn't. So I wasn't able to find... I wasn't able to figure out whether these show up in early enough in Act 1 for the amount of damage to be relevant, but if they show up relatively early in Act 1, they could be worth picking up if you have the spare carry weight. Obviously, the challenge with these barrels is always that they're incredibly heavy, so you need to have quite a lot of carry weight to make use of them, but if you've got it, then throwing a Brine Barrel isn't a totally embarrassing use of an action. I'm going to put it in C tier because it can occasionally come up, but isn't something that I recommend going out of your way to do, and if you forget these exist, it's not going to hurt you. Next, the Firewine Barrel. This is probably the most infamous of the barrels, because this is the one that is usually used to cheese encounters by stockpiling a whole bunch of them and then exploding them all at once to one-shot bosses, because it explodes for a whole lot of damage. The Firewine Barrel can be activated in any one of the 3 ways to activate a barrel, either by throwing it, by breaking it, or by igniting it with any source of fire damage. However, it has different effects depending on the method that you used to ignite it. Used to set it off. If you hit it with fire damage, it explodes, but if you break it with non-fire damage or by throwing it, which just does 1 damage and breaks it, then you get a 20-foot radius alcohol surface. I'll talk about each of these uses in turn because they're both actually pretty useful. Firstly, if you don't ignite the barrel, if you throw it or just break it, you get an alcohol surface. A 20-foot radius alcohol surface does nothing by itself, but if then subsequently hit with fire damage, it ignites, turning into a fire surface, doing 1d4 damage to enemies standing on it, and also setting them on fire for a guaranteed 2d4 damage. That's pretty good. It takes 2 actions to both throw the barrel and then ignite it, but guaranteed damage is always interesting. Igniting a whole bunch of enemies can be pretty useful. The other thing that you can do with an alcohol surface is freeze it. If you hit it with any form of ice damage, it turns into a giant ice surface. And a 20-foot radius ice surface is very, very powerful in Baldur's Gate 3. An ice surface causes enemies to slip and fall if they are standing on it, and that will use your character's save DC, so they'll typically fall pretty easily, and if they fall on their turn, they lose the rest of their turn. So if you break a Firewine Barrel and then freeze the alcohol under your enemies, you actually end up with a very powerful crowd control tool. The sort of modal effect of this, where you can use it for guaranteed damage or for crowd control with freezing, is pretty good, and actually by itself is kind of worth the 2 actions that you spend to do that, provided that you are trying to conserve spell slots or don't have any good, just normal attacks to use on your turn. The Firewine Barrel can come up in that sense. But obviously, that's not what we're here for. We want the big booms, so let's talk about what happens if you ignite it. If you place the Firewine Barrel on the ground without destroying it, without dealing damage to it, and then hit it with any form of fire damage, it explodes, dealing 4d6 plus 18 fire damage for an average of 32 damage in a 20-foot radius. Now, alone amongst basically every item in the game, every consumable item in the game, rather than having a fixed save DC, this explosion actually uses your character's item save DC. I assume because they coded the item wrong. So this will if set off by a character with a high save DC or with items that increase your save DC, actually be quite difficult to resist the damage of this item. So unlike most of these items where enemies will almost always make the dex save and take half damage, the Firewine Barrel will often end up doing full damage, and 32 damage is a lot of damage. That's more average damage than a fireball, so it can absolutely be worth even spending 2 actions to set this up, because it's more damage and bigger radius than a fireball. Sometimes it's just worth 2 actions to get a level 3 spell. There's also lots of ways to set this up and activate it in a single turn by walking towards an enemy, dropping the item, which doesn't take an action, and then running away if you have enough movement speed, or jumping or misty stepping away with your bonus action, and then using your action to use some form of fire, either a thrown torch or a firebolt or something like that, to ignite the Firewine Barrel from a safe distance. You can also, in an emergency, ignite it on top of yourself. I don't typically recommend doing that, but there are probably some cases where that's right to do. So even if you aren't setting this up outside of combat to just delete enemies immediately, its in-combat use is still quite powerful, either as an ice surface or a fire surface or an explosive. Admittedly somewhat tricky to set up explosive. The Firewine Barrel's versatility and power gives it a lot of uses as an in-combat item as well. I should also mention that if you do set it off with fire, it does create an alcohol surface still, but that alcohol surface immediately catches fire. But that's good, because then enemies take the damage from the surface as well as the burning damage. So it's actually 46 plus 18 plus 2d4 damage if the enemy gets another turn. So that's even slightly more damage, and there's a little bit more guaranteed damage as well. For that reason, the versatility and power level of this item, I'm going to place the Firewine Barrel in S tier. I think it's incredibly good. While it is a little finicky to use, and you do have to get used to judging distance, like eyeballing the distance to enemies and stuff like that to walk up, place it properly, and get away before you explode, you can really make use of this for a lot of damage, especially if your party is mobile enough to place these appropriately. You can also have characters, move around invisibly, stealth around, teleport around, jump through an arcane gate or dimension door to drop these. There's all kinds of cool things you can do with these, even aside from their use to cheese encounters outside of combat. S tier for the Firewine Barrel. Next up, the Nautiloid tank and the Oil Barrel. So these are functionally identical items. They do exactly the same thing in practice, despite the difference in appearance and description, although the Nautiloid tank weighs less, so is a little bit easier to carry around if you're worried about your encumbrance and want to carry these items. The Nautiloid tank and oil barrel can be thrown or broken to create an oil surface, or ignited to create an explosion, similar to the Firewine Barrel. An oil surface is just an flammable area. It cannot be the alcohol surface, it can't be frozen. So a 20-foot radius flammable surface for throwing or breaking one of these barrels is honestly not that exciting. To use it in combat, you have to spend an action or an attack action to throw it, and then a subsequent attack action usually to light it, although you can also hit an existing source of fire with it to immediately set it off. If you hit a torch or open flame that's on the ground, or a wall of fire or something, you can get an extra fire surface from it immediately. But if you're doing that, you might as well just get the explosion by throwing the barrel into the existing fire as well. A oil barrel that is ignited either by setting it off or throwing it into an existing fire surface is going to explode, dealing 6d6 fire damage with a DC 12 dex save for half in a 20-foot radius AoE. Then it similarly creates an oil surface or mysterious liquid surface in the case of the Nautiloid tank, which ignites. So similar to the Firewine Barrel, you get an extra 2d4 guaranteed damage out of it from the fire surface damage and the burning damage. Altogether, this is a pretty reasonable effect that you can use. You can basically spend 2 actions to set it up, or 1 action if the environment is appropriate for setting it off immediately, to do a decent amount of damage. But 6d6 with a DC 12 dex save for half, and a fire surface is a much less interesting action than 4d6 plus 18. It's just significantly less damage overall, and because of the low dex save, you are less likely to get maximum damage out of it. Guaranteed damage is still interesting and can often be worth spending multiple actions on, but the lower damage and reduced versatility on these compared to the Firewine Barrel, because you can't use them to create an ice surface, definitely reduces the impact of these items somewhat significantly. The amount of damage that you get is still fine, and one that you will not be sad to have spent some actions setting up, or spent a turn setting up and setting off, but in general, you are going to be able to use an action on your turn that does just as much as this. So I tend to think that the amount of finicky maneuvering that you have to do to get these to work is just not as interesting as for some of the other barrels. I'm going to put them in B tier because I think they are powerful and pretty usable in a lot of circumstances, but I wouldn't necessarily go out of your way to use them if you're not using them to cheese encounters before they start one-shotting enemies outside of combat. Next, the Runepowder Barrel and the Runepowder Bomb. This is another pair of functionally identical items, although the Runepowder Bomb is just very slightly shorter. The model is slightly shorter, so under some circumstances it can be harder to draw a line of sight to if you're trying to set it off with a firebolt or an arrow or something like that, but for the most part, these are identical items. These can be set off either by hitting them with any source of fire damage or by reducing their hit points to 0, but because they have more than just the one hit point, unlike most barrels, throwing them usually will not be enough to set them off. If you throw them, you won't actually break it, and so you won't get the effect. Whereas if you reduce its hit points to 0 by just attacking it, or hit it with any source of fire damage, it'll go off and explode. It's the same effect no matter how you set it off, but you usually won't be able to set it off just by throwing it. When you do set it off, they do 10d8 plus 40 force damage for an average of 85 damage, which obviously is a ridiculous amount of damage, with a DC 12 dexterity save for half in a 59-foot radius, a truly massive radius. Now, this 59-foot radius is actually 59 feet, compared to the actually 60-foot range of most attacks, or things like Firebolt. So technically, you can set it off from outside of its radius with a 60-foot range attack if you're at exactly the edge of your attack range. I don't recommend trying this because the game is extremely imprecise with distances, and sometimes you will still just blow yourself up anyways, and given that these do 85 average damage, you do not want to be caught in the blast when they go off. The amount of damage that the Runepowder Barrel and Runepowder Bomb do is nonsensically high, and even more than that, it's an automatic critical hit against objects, so any non-creature things, just environmental objects or stuff that you might have to destroy for certain encounters, it gets a critical hit against and is even better at destroying. There are only 4 of these available in the game, so you do have to decide somewhat carefully when you're going to use them, and obviously they're incredibly difficult to use if you're trying to use them actually in combat, just because of the gigantic radius, but they are ludicrously powerful when you do. The amount of damage that you get, even if enemies are fairly likely to pass the saving throw, is obviously ridiculous and absolutely worth spending however many actions it takes to set up the explosion to make it happen. So let's take a moment to talk about how you can use these in combat without having to cheese combats ahead of time, though obviously you can still use these, just like all the other explosive barrels before combat starts, to just one-shot enemies. Way number 1 is with AoE spells. If you place this on the ground and then use an AoE spell, because you can throw it, you can, without breaking it, you can throw it to an enemy and then have that character run away, and then have another character use an AoE spell to set it off from outside of the 60-foot range. You can basically gain a little bit of extra range with most AoE spells, so if you have a fireball or something, as long as you're stood 70 feet away, you can still catch the Runepowder Barrel in the fireball and set it off. Another way is with teleportation effects. You can use Misty Step plus movement, or Dimension Door plus movement, or the easiest is probably Arcane Gate, drop it, and then move, in order to place the Runepowder Barrel and Runepowder Bomb exactly where you want. Another way is with Globe of Invulnerability. If your party is in a Globe of Invulnerability, it doesn't matter whether you're standing right on top of the nuke when it goes off, because you are invulnerable. So a lot of arenas, this will cover the entire arena, but you can just cast Globe of Invulnerability, drop the Runepowder Barrel at your own feet, and then set it off with another character or with a bonus action of some kind, in order to immediately blow up the entire arena. All of these are incredibly powerful options and absolutely worth doing, because the Runepowder Barrel and Runepowder Bomb do so much damage, and cleverly setting them up is one of the most satisfying things to do in Baldur's Gate 3, in my opinion. I say cleverly setting them up because setting them up before combat feels a little bit cheesy, but actually maneuvering the game so that you can use them during combat feels incredibly satisfying. There's very few of them, and you have to work to get them, so it feels earned when you blow up an encounter with this, and I do recommend figuring out cool ways to use them and using them. It also has to be said that these are just incredibly fun because they're so explosive, and obviously I'm going to put them in S tier because they're ridiculously powerful, although it does require a little bit of work to set them up. Next up, the Smokepowder Barrel. So, similar to the Firewine or oil barrels, this has a different effect if you break it or if you ignite it while it's still intact. If you break it open, you get a smoke powder surface, 20-foot radius, either at the location where you broke it or where you threw it to. And the smoke powder surface doesn't do anything by itself, but can be ignited to create a big explosion. The explosion does 2d6 fire damage with a DC 12 dex save for half, and 2d6 force damage with no saving throw, and knocks back enemies out of it a very long distance with no saving throw. And it doesn't seem to matter what size the creature is. If they're not immune to being knocked around in some way, they get pushed quite far. The distance seems to be somewhat randomized, and I haven't been able to test enough to calculate the distance properly, but enemies will definitely get knocked back a fair way. No save knockback is pretty powerful, so even just the smoke powder surface is very good in and of itself. If you ignite the intact barrel, you get 4d4 plus 18 force damage as an explosion. You get a big explosion, 20-foot radius explosion of 28 average damage, 4d4 plus 18, and with a DC 12 dex save for half. Obviously, that's a very low dexterity save, so enemies are very likely to make it, but that's still 28 force damage is a lot of damage. That's the same average damage as a fireball, but in force damage, which is better. And then the smoke powder surface effect still goes off. So if you ignite this barrel, you get basically a fireball plus 2d6 fire damage, 2d6 force damage, and a big no-save knockback. You can use this to reposition enemies very easily. The damage is very impressive from this item. So even though it lacks the alternate use that the Firewine Barrel has, where you can turn it into a big ice surface, just setting off this barrel for a whole bunch of damage and a no-save knockback is really, really good. There are lots of circumstances where knocking enemies around is powerful, and doing so with no save is something that is going to always interest me, because a lot of the difficulty with knockback effect is that they have very low saving throws. Well, the smoke powder barrel has no saving throw. Enemies will always be knocked back into pits, etc. So you can use this to one-shot enemies, in addition just to the amount of damage that it does, or repositioning them into AoE effects, and so on. Smoke powder barrel, therefore, just a very efficient use of your action. Again, requires some setup. You have to walk forward, place it down, walk backwards, then ignite it, but it's definitely worth doing that because no-save knockbacks are very powerful, and the amount of damage you get from it is awesome. S tier. Next up, the water barrel. So the water barrel is exactly what it sounds like. It's a barrel of water. You can throw it to create a big puddle. You get a 20-foot radius water surface wherever you throw the barrel or wherever you break it in the world. And a water surface can subsequently be used to create a steam cloud if hit with fire damage, an electrical surface if hit with lightning damage, or an ice surface if hit with cold damage. You know how I feel about ice surfaces, so the water barrel, just for its ability to make a giant radius puddle, is pretty good. good. Think of it as a third level Create Water, because it's just like an upcasted Create Water, so you're getting a level 3 spell already. The real draw here, though, is that everything that you hit within the 20-foot radius where you throw the water barrel becomes wet. The ability to get the entire encounter wet all at once, just to get a whole bunch of enemies wet all at the same time, just like in your most secret of fan fictions, is incredibly powerful. Wet inflicts vulnerability to lightning and cold damage, and being able to do that to an entire encounter at once is going to let you have any character that has cold and lightning damage one-shot the encounter. You'll notice that I mentioned cold damage within this description already. If you hit enemies who've just been struck by a water barrel with cold damage, they take double damage from the cold damage, and then the water freezes, so they're stuck on an ice surface and have to fall over. You can also use this on your own party, even if they're fairly spread out, to give them resistance to fire, which is pretty powerful. Douse burning and make them immune to subsequent burning. So all of that is just an incredibly powerful use for the water barrel, because the wet condition is just so broken in Baldur's Gate 3. The ability to just double all of your cold and lightning damage is amazing. The fact that it's in such a large radius is awesome. It's very similar to the humble water bottle, which I talked about in the episode on grenades, but bigger. And bigger in this game is usually better, especially for an effect that is really bad for your enemies and good for yourself. So the water barrel is, of course, S tier. My favorite use for the water barrel is when thrown by a Berserker Barbarian, because that's just both on theme and very funny. Knocks over enemies, gets them all wet, and then you can freeze it to keep them on the ground. S tier item for the water barrel. Next, Popdrakes, Squidjins, and Wogglims. So these are all functionally identical items, all three of the fireworks. They have different graphics, but do exactly the same thing in practice. These seem like they're grenades or explosives or scrolls, and they're kind of a cross between all three of those items. Similar to the other explosives, they can be dropped at a location and then ignited using fire damage to get the explosion, so you can always do the same thing with the barrels, with the fireworks that you could do with barrels. You can also throw them, activate them by throwing them, but instead of using the normal throw interface when you throw the Popdrake or the other fireworks, they activate and travel in a straight line towards the target, where they will deal 3d6 fire damage in a small AoE when they arrive. Traveling in a straight line instead of being actually thrown like a grenade is kind of is a slight advantage in most circumstances, because it means it's usually a little bit easier to draw line of sight to where you actually want to hit. The grenades arc in a curve and will often run into like beams or the roof of certain arenas, and it can be hard to place them at long range. The Popdrakes, Squidjins, and Wogglims will always go exactly where you want them because they move in a straight line. When they get there, they do 3d6 fire damage in a small radius AoE, and inflict color spray on enemies with a dexterity save to halve the damage and ignore the color spray effect. That dexterity save is based on your character's item save DC. It's not a fixed save. So these are better used for spellcasters or characters who have DC increasing items, because they will benefit from that, since it uses your character's actual save DC. The color spray effect on these items is also buggy. It seems to have 0 duration. I think it's supposed to have 1 duration, but whenever you use it, it will go on an enemy, and then they'll like gain the color spray effect, and then they will immediately lose it in the next entry in the combat log. So I think the color spray effect here was set to have 0 duration. If somebody wants to test that more and see if that is actually 100% consistent, then definitely I'd appreciate that. But that was my experience testing these items, is that the color spray effect doesn't work because it seems to have been given a 0 duration, so it just goes on and then goes off immediately. I guess you could use it with things that care about inflicting effects, like the Boots of Stormy Clamor or something like that. If it actually worked to inflict color spray with the blind, then this would be a slightly more interesting effect, as is a what you're basically getting is a scroll of chromatic orb for fire, but without the surface, without the fire surface. You just get 3d6 fire damage with a dexterity saving throw for half in a small AoE. That's an okay item. I mean, it's not an item that you're going to turn down, but it's not an item that you're excited to get by the time you get these in Act 3. If you use them as explosives and drop a whole bunch of them, they can obviously be powerful, just like all of these other explosives. If you stack a million of them, you can one-shot encounters with them. But the way that they're actually activated in-game using the mechanic that the game seems to want you to use isn't very good and doesn't work. I'm going to put them in C tier because guaranteed damage, I mean, it's still just 3d6 halved damage at worst, and guaranteed damage in a small AoE is never terrible. You can use this as a stand-in for Magic Missile, just to kill a very low health enemy. So having one or two of these on a few different party members just in case can be reasonable, but it's not something that I would go out of my way to pick up or use in combat, so we're going to put them in C tier. Next up, the box of fireworks and the box of Oddfire fireworks. These are functionally identical items again, although the box of Oddfire fireworks is very slightly taller. It uses a slightly taller model, so you will be able to hit it just slightly easier over a ledge or something like that if that comes up. These have the same tooltip as the Popdrakes, Squidjins, and Wogglims, where it says, as an action, send a rocket of firework flame at a foe, blasting the target and inflicting color spray, but it claims it does 8d6 fire damage instead of 3d6. What it doesn't do is any of that. When you activate this item, you throw it. It will use the throw action the same way the Popdrakes, Squidjins, and Wogglims do. But instead of turning into a firework and traveling towards the enemy, you just throw the box and it breaks and nothing happens. This item just does not work the way that it says it does, and I assume the way that it's intended to do. You can drop it and then set it off using fire damage, the same way as you can any of the other explosives, though. But you can't throw it or activate it like a firework. If you could do that, it would be pretty interesting, because the ability to fire off an 8d6 fire damage explosion at range would be pretty good. That's basically a fireball in a box, and fireball in a box is a pretty interesting item. But fireball that you have to carefully place next to an enemy before igniting is a much less interesting item. Similar to the oil barrel and Nautiloid tank, this is a decent amount of damage and can still be worth setting up next to enemies, but unlike those items, you cannot use them to create the surfaces, so you can't use them for the fire damage surfaces. That mostly doesn't matter, because if you're throwing this, you're throwing it into an existing source of fire to get the explosion, but most of the time you are going to use it to drop it and then set off the explosion with ignition, or and this is my actual recommendation if you're playing through the game, keep it in your inventory in case they just fix this item and it starts working the way that it's supposed to, because then it would actually be a pretty good item. As is, I'm going to say that this is probably a B tier item. 8d6 fire damage is still worth going out of your way for it within an AoE. It's still worth going out of your way for in some circumstances. But it is broken. If it worked properly, I would put it in A tier, because I think that would actually be very good, maybe even S tier. Also the color spray does the color spray effect from the explosion is the same as this and is at 0 duration as well, so you don't get any color spray. This item is very buggy and maybe will get fixed in patch 7, so hang on to those, I guess, just in case. But in the meantime, you can drop them and set them off using fire damage and get at least a decent explosion out of them. Next up, the satchels. So these three satchels work similarly to the explosive barrels in that you can ignite them with fire damage and then they explode, but differently in some key ways. When thrown, the Smokepowder Satchels don't the Smokepowder Satchel and the other satchels don't break, so you can throw them to a location and then subsequently ignite them. This can be pretty useful to allow you to actually position these where you want them on the battlefield before you explode them, without having to walk there yourself and drop them the way that you do with the explosive barrels in order to get them there without breaking them. The smoke powder Satchel itself, when exploded, deals 3d4 plus 9 force damage for an average damage of 7.5 plus 9 is 16.5 damage, with a DC 12 dexterity save for half in a 13-foot radius. So it's a smaller radius than the barrel explosions, but still a pretty large radius. And 3d4 plus 9 force damage with a DC 12 dex save for half is guaranteed damage, which is always interesting, but not much guaranteed damage. So given that you're probably going to have to spend 2 actions or some careful setup to get this to work, the Smokepowder Satchel is definitely somewhat difficult to use reliably. However, when it does explode, it also creates a smoke powder surface similar to the Smokepowder Barrel, which then explodes for 2d6 more fire damage and 2d6 more force damage, DC 12 dex save to have the fire damage, but no save for the force damage, and no save for the subsequent knockback. Being able to knock back enemies with no save is just really, really good and very, very powerful. So the Smokepowder Satchel is pretty interesting for that reason, just to reposition enemies. The damage is marginal, but the repositioning of enemies is pretty powerful, so I'm going to put it in A tier. Next up, the surprise-based teddy bear. So this is a complete side note, but before I talk about this item, I do have to talk about the name, because the fact that this is called a teddy bear seems to imply that not only did Theodore Roosevelt exist in Faerun at some point, but so did Washington Post editorial cartoons, because that's where the name teddy bear comes from. It was named after the US president. So the fact that this is called a teddy bear means that somehow, somewhere in the history of Baldur's Gate, either there was a truly astonishing set of convergent evolution, or Theodore Roosevelt was somewhere back in Faerunian history. So the world-building implications of this item are in and of themselves fascinating. The item itself is functionally very similar to the oil barrel. It does, when hit with fire damage, it does 6d6 fire with a DC 15 dex save to have it in a 13-foot radius AoE. So it's a smaller radius than the oil barrel or Nautiloid tank explosion, but a more difficult dexterity save. Overall, I think that's typically going to be better, because you'd just rather... 13-foot radius is still enough to hit all of the enemies that you really need to hit in most encounters, so having the higher dex save is going to be better. It's also a little better than the oil barrel and Nautiloid tank because you can throw it and then subsequently ignite it, which you can't with those items. Because those break when thrown, you don't get the benefit of being able to stay at range. You have to actually walk up and place them to explode them, whereas the surprise-based teddy bear, you can throw and then subsequently ignite from range without ever having to get close to the enemies. That's a pretty big advantage in terms of actually using this, although again it takes 2 actions to set off 6d6 fire damage, and 2 actions, or walking forward, placing it, backing off, hitting it with fire, in order to do 6d6 fire damage is definitely a lot of work in order to get a relatively marginal effect, but the amount of damage that it does is pretty reasonable. Overall, I'm going to say that, similar to the oil barrel and the box of fireworks, the amount of damage is not that impressive, and the amount of work that it takes to set up is significant, so I'm going to put it in B tier. But it is because it's a little bit less damage than these two, but a little bit easier to set up, so a little bit less damage overall because it doesn't make the oil surface that then ignites and so on, but a little bit easier to set up, a little bit easier to land. So very similar to the oil barrel and box of fireworks in terms of how powerful the surprise-based teddy bear is, aside from the grand cosmic implications of the naming convention. And finally, the Runepowder Vial. So this one is unique. There's only one of them in the entire game, but it is one of these satchels similarly, so you can throw it without destroying it, and then you can ignite it for the explosion. The explosion is a 25-foot radius AoE, and importantly, it is much, much larger than the game's targeting indicator shows when you throw the Runepowder Vial. When you throw the vial, it will show the standard 7-foot radius for a grenade explosion. But you should bear in mind that the actual explosion radius is more than 3 times the explosion radius that it shows on the screen. So do not accidentally stand inside the radius of the Runepowder Vial. But also you can hit a lot more enemies with it than it looks like. Just the game will try to trick you like that, so do be aware. Within the explosion, creatures caught will take 5d4 plus 18 force damage, which is an average of 30.5 force damage, with a dexterity saving throw DC 12 to have it. So you'll do pretty good damage even if enemies make the saving throw, which they will very reliably. Enemies are also knocked back without a saving throw at all, and a no save knockback is pretty powerful. The large radius on this does make it a little bit harder to use, similar to the Runepowder Barrel and Runepowder Bomb. And the fact that it has to be thrown and then ignited, or dropped and then ignited, you don't get any value from just throwing it, does definitely hold this item back a little, but the effect is still very powerful. It's just a Smokepowder Satchel, but more so. It's bigger, more damage, giant radius, and so on, and obviously that's very powerful. Is it enough to bump it up a tier from the Smokepowder Satchel? I don't think so. Honestly, you're using both of these items for the knockback. The bigger AoE on the knockback actually makes it harder to control where the enemies go, which is what you want from this kind of item. And while the damage is good, it's not going to be like the most impressive damage in the entire world, so I'm going to put this also in A tier. It's very similar damage to the explosive barrels that I put in S tier, but without the alternate use cases where you can throw them and get the surfaces and so on. So the Runepowder Vial, I think, despite being obviously better than the Smokepowder Satchel in most ways, the bigger radius is both an upside and a downside for an item that you want to use primarily to position enemies with, and so I'm going to put it in A tier alongside the Smokepowder Satchel. When you want damage, Runepowder Vial is better. When you want more precise positioning, the Smokepowder Satchel is often easier, and important to remember that the Runepowder Vial lies to you about the damage radius, so do be careful when you are activating it. Alright, my friends, I hope that you've enjoyed the secret bonus tier list for the barrels, satchels, and fireworks. These were also a really interesting set of items to rate, because obviously the way that they're normally used is a deeply abusive use of just one-shotting encounters before they start, but I think that a lot of these items are actually still pretty interesting just to use in combat normally. In my opinion, the most fun way to use most of these barrels, other than the Runepowder Barrel, which is cool enough that I think it deserves an exception, and you can try to find a good spot to use it, is to only use the barrels that are actually present in the combat arena that you're fighting in, rather than lugging them around from place to place, both because the inventory management gets annoying, and because I think often the temptation to just one-shot encounters is going to be overpowering, and then you'll lose out on a lot of fun and challenge. But obviously, having a bunch of explosives as a back pocket panic button for if things are really looking tough in an honor mode run can be very important. And even if you never use Barrelmancy to one-shot an enemy, you can still get a lot of value out of using these items because they're all very powerful. Especially the water barrel is just generically applicable in like every fight, so carrying a few of those around, as many as you can afford the carry weight for, can be very useful. Alright, my friends, hope that you've enjoyed the video, and as always, if you have, feel free to leave a comment and like the video. Both of those things help me out a ton with the algorithm, and you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 build guides and other strategy game content. Cheers, folks. I'll catch you next time.